Friday the 24th. Thank you. Right, let us go to the 10-minute motion. Let us start with Peter Dowd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring a bill to amend the Working Time Regulations 1998 to reduce the maximum working week from 48 hours per week to 32 hours per week and to provide for overtime pay and connected purposes. Mr. Speaker, it was almost a century ago that British workers switched from a 6-day week to a 5-day week. It used to be the case that Saturday was included in a standard working week, but between the 1920s and the 1940s, the 5-day working week, along with the weekend, became the normal way of working across most of the Western world. One of the early pioneers was Ford Motor Company in the United States. On May the 1st, 1926, Ford became the first major company in America to adopt a 5-day, 40-hour week for workers in its automotive factories. Edsel Ford, Henry Ford's son and the company's president, said, "Every man needs more than 1 day a week for rest and recreation. We believe that in order to live properly, every man should have more time to spend with his family." Though workers' time was reduced, productivity went up. Manufacturers all over the country soon followed Ford's lead. Closer to home, John Boot, the chairman of Boots Cosmetic Company, initiated the same experiment. Again, he found that 2 days off each week had a positive effect on productivity and reduced absenteeism. The weekend was made official Boots policy in 1934. Those arguing against such a move at the time said that the country would suffer economically. Businesses won't be able to afford it, and workers won't be able to adapt. Mr. Speaker, they were proved wrong. It should be put on record that without sustained campaigns by the trade union movement that began towards the end of the 19th century and lasted many decades, the weekend, which we all enjoy today, would never have been won. It is with this historical context that honourable and right honourable members should reflect on the surge in the popularity we are seeing today for a 4-day working week. The 9-to-5, 5-day working week still remains the dominant model of work across much of the Western world. But it's important to remember that it was designed for the industrial and agricultural economy we had at the time. Members would agree, I'm sure, that 100 years later, the world of work has completely transformed. However, working hours have not adapted to the changing nature of work. Campaigners for a 4-day week say the 9-to-5, 5-day working week is outdated and no longer fit for purpose. A look back at our more recent history suggests they have a point. Since the 1980s, working hours in the UK have barely reduced at all, despite the productivity gains of the last few decades. None of this has been passed on to workers through more free leisure time. Mr. Speaker, we are long overdue an update, and the COVID pandemic has given us that opportunity. The UK is currently taking part in the biggest ever experiment of a 4-day week with no loss of pay for workers. 70 companies and over 3,300 workers are taking part in a pilot run by 4-Day Week Global, the think tank Autonomy, and the 4-Day Week campaign. A survey of the companies taking part at the halfway point suggests that the trial is going extremely well. The pilot has companies taking part from a diverse range of sectors. There's hospitality, manufacturing, healthcare, housing, telecommunications, construction and financial services. And it may seem counterintuitive that working less hours results in greater productivity, but there is already surmounting evidence that proves the hypothesis. Wherever the 4-day week with no loss of pay has been trialled across the world, it's been a win-win for both workers and employers. Productivity has improved, and so has the well-being of workers. When Microsoft in Japan trialled a 4-day week, they found product increased by 40%. In Iceland, the country, not the company, the largest ever public sector shorter working week trial was, quote, an overwhelming success and resulted in 86% of Iceland's working population gaining the right to shorten their hours. From 2015 to 19, Iceland ran 2 large-scale trials of a reduced working week of 35 to 36 hours with no reduction in pay. The analysis of the results, which included 2,500 workers, demonstrate the transformative effects of a shorter working week for both employees and businesses. Productivity and service provision remain the same or improved across the majority of trial workplaces. Worker well-being dramatically increased across a range of indicators, from perceived stress and burnout to health and work-life balance. The trials also remained revenue neutral for both the City Council and the Government. So I was pleased to see last month that South Cambridgeshire District Council became the first ever UK council to move forward with plans for a 4-day week. So a 3-month trial of a 4-day week with no loss of pay will begin in January for all desk-based staff at the council, and if successful, a trial of the council's blue-collar workers, such as bin collection crews, will follow later next year. And of course, there are other major benefits for businesses that are worth noting: a reduction in 6 days and the ability to retain sick days, and the ability to retain staff and attract new talent, which is increasingly important in a tight labour market. So, for example, when Atom Bank, the largest UK 4-day week employer, made the switch, they found job applications increased by an astonishing 500% in just 3 months. The 4-day trial, the 4-day 32-hour week, is a multi-dividend policy which ultimately is about giving everyone the time to live happier and more fulfilled lives. Long working hours are an acute problem in this country. According to the TUC, British workers put in some of the longest full-time hours in Europe, while having one of the least productive economies in comparison and the fewest number of bank holidays. According to the Health and Safety Executive, 18 million workdays were lost in 2019-20 as a result of work-related stress, depression or anxiety. Furthermore, the World Health Organization has shown that long working hours are killing hundreds of thousands of people globally every year. Mr. Speaker, it's time for change. The arguments made against the 4-day working week today are exactly the same arguments that were made against the 5-day week 100 years ago. I'm afraid the evidence just doesn't back it up. All the evidence shows a 4-day week with no loss of pay would be good for the economy, good for workers and good for the environment. We shouldn't forget the impact such a move could also have on bringing down carbon emissions. One study has suggested that by simply working 1 day less, carbon emissions could fall by up to 127 million tonnes per year, and that's the equivalent of taking all private cars off the road. The pandemic has undoubtedly shaken up the world of work, and already we've seen a huge rise in remote working, flexible working, part-time, and yes, a 4-day working week. Change is coming, and this government and my own party should grasp it. Mr. Speaker, we could be leading the world in moving to a 4-day week, and my bill today will enable us to do just that. The same old arguments about the economy suffering were made against the introduction of the weekend, holiday pay, maternity pay, the living wage, equal pay, and they're being made against the 4-day week today. These arguments were wrong then, and they are wrong now. And the growing number of businesses adopting a 4-day week successfully in this country are proving them wrong. Long working hours and low wages is no way to live. This bill includes a clause that will ensure that anyone working beyond a 32-hour working week is paid extra in overtime. This is in recognition of falling wages and falling living standards that this country has experienced over the last decade or so. Mr. Speaker, the movement for a shorter working week is growing in strength and momentum. Honourable members, I'm proud to support this movement, and I urge colleagues to support this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Now, the honourable member to have leave to bring in the bill. Sir Christopher Chope.
Mr. Speaker, may I thank the honourable gentleman for bringing forward a measure which single-handedly should unite everybody on these benches in their belief that there is a real continuing threat from the prospect of a Labour government which would be intent on destroying our economy. The honourable gentleman has articulated one such way in which that would happen, and I'm delighted to see that he's got his right honourable friend, the member for Hayes and Harlington, in the chamber to support him this afternoon. And of course, he himself is the honourable member for Bootle himself is a former shadow chief secretary to the Treasury. In his remarks, he suggested that there are virtues, or can be virtues, in having a 4-day working week. I don't think anybody's disputing that, and there's a freedom, which he recognised at the moment, for employers or individuals to work 4 days a week, to limit their work to 32 hours. But unfortunately, that's not what his bill says, and I'm going to read it out, Mr. Speaker. It says it's a bill to amend the Working Time Regulations 1998 to reduce the maximum working week from 48 hours to 32 hours per week. In other words, to prevent people being able to work for more than 32 hours, and to provide overtime pay and for connected purposes. So effectively what he's saying is that everybody who is currently working more than 32 hours a week would be prevented from so doing in the future under the provisions of his bill. And if ever one could think of a hand grenade being thrown into the economy, that is probably a really good example of it. Preventing people being able to work longer hours and forcing them to reduce their hours at a time when we've got really high levels of employment and very low levels of unemployment. So when somebody is forced to only be able to work 4 days a week, who's going to fill the gap? Who's going to work the time that the person's not working? We're told that there's a crisis within the health service around the number of people working in the health service. So the junior doctors to whom the working time regulations were applied in, I think, 2004, those doctors would not be allowed to work for more than 32 hours a week. How is that going to help the National Health Service? It's not going to help it at all. It's going to undermine its effectiveness. But Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman has done us, I think, a great service, because what he has reminded us is that the Working Time Directive, upon which the 1998 regulations were based, emanated from the European Union, and it was implemented in this country under duress because the EU interpreted the Working Time Directive as being a health and safety measure for which there was no veto, and it could be proceeded with under a qualified majority of voting. So it's a timely reminder that the present government, which quite rightly is committed to supply-side reforms and removing unnecessary regulations upon our workforce, amongst others, that it's a timely reminder that actually this government could, and in my view should, get to grips with the issue of the Working Time Directive and the Working Time regulations. And my basis for saying this is that in the period between 1993 and 1997, when the Working Time Directive was being discussed in this country and the implications flowing from it, I was a member of the Health and Safety Commission, Mr. Speaker. And the Health and Safety Commission produced a series of papers in which it was made quite clear that the Working Time Directive had nothing whatsoever to do with health and safety. It was all to do with employment protection on the continent of Europe. And it was a specious justification for the introduction of these regulations to label them as being health and safety regulations, merely so that they could be imposed on this country, as I've said, under the qualified majority of voting that applied at the time. So working time has got nothing whatsoever to do with health and safety. It's a legitimate issue in relation to employers and employees, and it's certainly a very important issue in relation to productivity. The Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right in saying that some of the organisations which have increased their productivity by reducing the length of time that their workers work is because they benefited from that because there has been more productivity from the workforce. But there's no evidence that by making this compulsory, it would result in higher productivity. All it would do is result in much higher and unbearable costs for both employers in the private sector and also significantly employers in the public sector. So once again, Madam Deputy Speaker, can I say that I think that this is a timely intervention by the honourable gentleman and his allies on the Labour benches, and I'm sure that if his bill was to be put to a vote today, it will receive overwhelming support from his parliamentary colleagues. It wouldn't receive any support at all from our side. But I'm not going to divide the House on this, because I'm a believer that actually everybody should have the right to bring in whatever bill they want to, and I've exercised that right on many occasions. But I think it's important in a 10-minute rule bill debate to put on record that were such a bill to be drafted and brought forward for debate by the honourable gentleman, then it would be very hotly opposed by everybody on this side, although we would enjoy the spectacle of seeing that so many on his own side would be having to eat their words because they talk the talk of high growth, but obviously a measure like this, which would be a compulsory measure applying to all employers up and down the country, will be very damaging to growth. It would undermine the right of people to be able to work hard, to look after their families, to spend their money as they wish. It would be an impoverishing exercise for so much of our economy and so many of the people engaged in our economy. And I think it's important in a debate like this that we should also remind our own colleagues on the front bench that there's a lot more to be done to deregulate the labour market, and the Working Time Directive is now completely surplus to our requirements, and I would like to see a bill brought forward to repeal the working time regulations and all that flows from them, because they have been developed insidiously over the years since 1998. They have been, originally it was said that it should only deal with people, for example, drivers' hours and people employed in the transport industry, the mobile members in the transport industry. It was then extended to cover almost everybody with a sedentary occupation in any of those industries. And as I've said, then in the early 2000s, it was extended to cover doctors as well. So the Working Time Directive is in itself responsible for an enormous lack of productivity and potential amongst our workforce in the country. And I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving me the opportunity of trying to goad our government into action on this point. But in the meantime, I put on record my strong opposition to everything contained in the honourable gentleman's bill.
Thank you. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As mayors that opinion, say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Kim Johnson, Yasmin Qureshi, Mary Rimmer, Judith Cummins, Mike Amesbury, Tony Lloyd, Ian Byrne, Dan Carden, Sir George Howarth, Mick Whitley and myself, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Mr. Peter Dowd.
Working Time Regulations Amendment Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday, 9th of December 2022, Madam Deputy.
Friday the 9th of December. Thank you. We now come to the programme number 2 motion.